I'm Gary Ferguson, and my first memories of surfing were obviously in Ocean City, Maryland. And I think it was John Fager at 22nd Street in front of the Surf and Sands Motel, where Johnny got his first surfboard, I think, in partnership with another fella. And at that time, I was riding surf mats, and boogie boards obviously weren't around at that time. So surf mats were the new wave kind of way of surfing waves. So we did that and body surfed. And then finally, I was introduced by Johnny to riding a surfboard. He had a 9.6 homemade surfboard, I think, and that's what took me off on the surfing. I got hooked the first time I caught a wave. I think he actually pushed me into my first wave, and it just, you felt the speed of a wave compared to the speed of a surf mat, and it was just like, going from a Volkswagen to a Ferrari kind of a thing. So it was, it really got me hooked. That was 1963, and I was just going from elementary school to junior high school, so I was just a youngin'. My parents lived on 27th Street. That was up in front of the Diplomat Hotel. That was at the very end of the boardwalk. And that was kind of the home break. Myself and Scott Suit and Bob Schaller were kind of the three surfers at the time that surfed up there. I felt like I kind of adapted fairly well because of my involvement with surf mats and body surfing. So the conversion from surf mats to surfboards, it was obviously more difficult, but I didn't have too many bad experiences. I recall Dana Chandler at the time, Dana Smith now, having a terrible occasion with a longboard where it was a nasty story where she purled the board and it went up in the air and came down fin first and cut her nose, right on the very end of the nose the fin did. The first time when I felt like I was really kind of hooked on surfing, I guess, was again with the longer boards, 9.6. They were big, thick things. I couldn't even hardly get it to the ocean myself. But the first time you feel the wave picking you up and you're actually paddling for the wave, it's a sensation that, it must be like the first time you jump out of an airplane if you're skydiving. It's that first kind of a rush that you get. And once you get that rush, once you get that feeling, it's amazing. And same way with the first tube ride you ever get. God knows if it's a tube ride or not in reality, but in your mind you feel like you're kind of in the curl, at the time, and you feel like you're really one with the ocean kind of a thing. And the first tube is always you remember that. It's kind of etched in your mind, and I remember it vividly. It was in front of again the Diplomat Hotel. There's a little jetty sitting out there and a nice little right-hander would form, and it was a perfect little wave for a little guy, and it was a fun wave. So that was when I started really getting into surfing on a regular basis. It took me about maybe a month, and I started feeling like I could paddle into a wave, start turning left and right. And George Pittman, I think he was the first one to kind of get me into the technique, because anybody can kind of paddle into a wave and go straight in like you would on a surf mat, but to start angling and starting going right, if you're regular foot, was relatively easy, but trying to go left was always a challenge. I couldn't figure out, how do you do that, and it was George Pittman who really taught me the basics. And he says, Gary, what you got to do is kind of look to your left, and sure enough, you'll go left. So that was a neat feeling, when it's kind of like your mind guiding your body kind of thing, and it's that psychological kind of surfing that you get used to. Some of my first heroes in surfing in Ocean City were probably Scott Suit. Scott Suit had a pink Velzy surfboard, and it was about a 9, 8, almost maybe even 10 foot. Pintail, real sharp pintail, but Scott Suit was a lifeguard in Ocean City at the time, and he was kind of somebody that most people who wanted to surf looked up to. I mean, Scott was, first off, he was a lifeguard, so he was very burly, big kind of a guy. The guy was 6'1", 6'2", used to play football and stuff, and Scott was, he was noted as being kind of a big wave surfer. He would go out on days when other guys would probably not consider going out. And he's the one who I kind of looked up to, and I think a lot of people did, in terms of being able to ride waves in Ocean City that were, northeaster type waves that were, overhead. Scott was one one of the early pioneers, I thought, who really kind of got folks motivated to surf. And his surfing ability was tremendous. I mean, he could encourage you, push you to go out on waves in days that otherwise you would look and say, no, I don't think so. I don't think that that would be a good thing to do. And Scott just had an ability to try and give you the confidence, because confidence is a big part of it. You know, obviously your physical condition is important, but your mental condition, feeling good out in the water is important. And Scott could do that. So Scott really gave me that first kind of impression, as well as the Johnson brothers, Skill Johnson particularly. Skill Johnson was always asking me to, you know, pushing me to the limits, trying to get me to go into bigger waves, and, you know, paddling across from Ocean City to Astig Island and surfing on that jetty side over there, which actually wasn't really a jetty at that time. They just had a sand point there. But paddling across that inlet when you have a tide coming in or going out was scary. Weekend warriors in Ocean City, when they used to come down, unfortunately, they used to come down in herds. I mean, it wasn't by oneself. It was always with a group. They always came down, I thought, with a group of other folks. But I think the attitude, at least from my recollection at the time, was the people in the water were very much more accommodating towards the outsiders coming in. I mean, I think even though they came down like from Baltimore, Washington, Delaware, wherever, with a lot of other folks, so you might be out in the water with 2 or 3 folks, and they would come out and it would be automatically crowded because of the people they would bring. There was never any resentment that I can recall. There was never any, you know, this is local break, get out of the water kind of a thing. It was always, at least my recollection's been, we were very accommodating. I mean, it was always folks would come and go, and we never, and actually, you get to know a lot of good friends that way. We met some people, you know, George Smith was one of those guys, and Michael Toole was those guys. Those guys came from Baltimore down to Ocean City because they were going to University of Maryland at the time. And they were somewhat weekend warriors, I believe. And so it was, to me, I thought it was more of, you know, an acceptance as opposed to local break, get out of the water kind of a thing, or don't get in my way kind of a thing. And, you know, at that time, there was so many waves, it seemed like, and so few surfers that there wasn't any conflict that you might see today. When you're with a bunch of your best friends and buddies, and the waves are big, and you would probably look at those waves and say to yourself, I don't know if I should be going out there. If you've got people to encourage you, I mentioned about people like Scott Suit and the Johnson brothers, how they would encourage you to go out. That goes a long way in helping you, and I think that having that kind of camaraderie with other friends of yours can, especially if you've got the physical ability, you may not have the mental capability at the time to think that you can do it, but if you've got the physical ability and you're confident in your physical ability, then I think your mental ability, if you have support group with you, then I think that those are the ones who encourage you to go out. I remember coming back, when I first came back from Vietnam, Dave Hartman, we came down here, Buxton, and it was after a northeast storm, and we went down to Frisco, and the wind was blowing north at about 30 miles an hour, which was totally offshore there. And it was me and David, and the waves were like about, you know, not double overhead, but they were overhead. And I hadn't been on a surfboard in 5 or 6 months, and we paddled out, and I was in front of him. And I shouldn't have been, I don't think I should have been out in those conditions, but it was Hartman who said, yeah, it'd be like the old days. We can go out there, we can do these waves. And, you know, just that rush of paddling out and someone saying you can do it, the confidence, and you kind of urging you to go out there. And we went out, and I spun around on a wave that was big. It was huge for me. And Autumn took a late takeoff, a late drop, made the bottom turn, and just got smashed. I mean, but that was the thing that I needed. I mean, you need to kind of, your confidence is built up knowing you can survive waves to some extent and come up and physically endure. And so confidence goes, I think, with the people around you as well as your own, you know, mental ability, you know, knowing that you can do what you think you can do. I think now my factor is fun. It's a fun factor. And if I don't feel like I'm going to have a good time out there, if I feel like I'm going to be a survivor as opposed to a surfer, then I don't go. And again, it just boils down to the fun factor. And I need to have fun. And if I'm not having fun out in the water, then I don't belong there.